What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. The 4th of July is now behind us, and what that means is the NFL season is right around the corner. So it's about time we start talking about your redraft fantasy football teams. I'm going to be going through over the next couple of weeks and updating all of my initial rankings to show you guys how I would be drafting these players in my redraft leagues. Today, we're going to be starting at the wide receiver position. So this is going to be a very crucial video for you guys at the start of your draft prep to hopefully get you guys ready to win that championship here in 2025. So we got a lot of players to talk about today. We're going through my top 36, so I don't want to waste any more time. Let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about these wide receivers. All right, so as you can see, I got the tier maker pulled up on the screen. We got 7 tiers to get through all 36 players, and I'm going to take my time and talk a little bit about each of these guys, giving you a little synopsis on how they went last year and how I'm viewing them going into the 2025 season. But let's start it off here in tier 1. My number 1 player at the wide receiver position, it's going to be Ja'Marr Chase. Look, this is a player who was the wide receiver 1 in 2024. He had 17 touchdowns and 1,700 yards. He outscored the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football by 74 total points. So he was absolutely dominant in 2024, and the Bengals are projected a top 5 team in pass rate again here in 2025. The defense is still very shaky overall, and I think this guy is locked in as the first overall wide receiver off of the board and definitely a first-round fantasy football pick. Now, the number 2 guy is pretty close if you ask me. Justin Jefferson, he averaged 1,600 yards in all healthy seasons so far throughout his career. He is a top 6 wide receiver every single year, except for the year in 2023 where he had an injury and didn't play the full slate. So he is a clear round 1 pick for me as well. And I think it is really just Jefferson and Chase as debate for the number 1 wide receiver. But obviously, as you guys can see by my rankings, I am leaning Ja'Marr Chase due to that quarterback play and the bad defense there in Cincinnati. But there are 2 more guys still in this tier that I have with them. My number 3 overall player is going to be CeeDee Lamb. This is a player who finished as the wide receiver 5 in 2024 despite a shoulder injury, and he lost Dak Prescott midseason as well. He averaged the 8th most yards and now has a healthy Dak Prescott and added help into this wide receiver room with George Pickens. And because of that, I think he's a very strong round 1 fantasy football target. And the other player in this tier for me is going to be Amon-Ra St. Brown. Now, he has 3 straight seasons of 100 plus catches and 1,100 receiving yards. Ben Johnson's departure may impact Detroit's offense just a little bit here in 2025, but I still think he is Goff's number 1 overall target. He did have a knee scope though in the offseason, missed the offseason program as well, a little bit of that. So that's something we're going to want to monitor in camp. However, if he's healthy, which I'm hoping he's healthy, I'm assuming he's healthy, obviously, if you can see by my number 4 rank, I do think he's still a reliable wide receiver 1. Let's move on to my tier 2. Tier 2, we're going to kick it off with my 5th overall wide receiver. It's Puka Nacua. From weeks 8 to 17 last year, he averaged 10 plus targets per game and had a 33% target share, which was second to only Ja'Marr Chase in targets, catches, and yards during that period of time. Now, even with Davante Adams joining this team, I do think the Rams offense is condensed, so both of those players can thrive in this offense, in my opinion. And I do think that Puka Nacua is one of the better first round values if you're in that, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 type of spot and you're looking for that wide receiver position. Let's go to Malik Nabers. Malik Nabers is my number 6 overall player. He was the wide receiver 7 in 2024 as a rookie. Despite some bad quarterback play from guys like Daniel Jones, Drew Lock, Tim Boyle, DeVito, all of these guys, man, very bad quarterback play, and he still finished as the wide receiver 7. He averaged 11.3 targets per game, had a 34.9% target share during that time, which was higher than Ja'Marr Chase, higher than CeeDee Lamb, higher than Puka Nacua. So I think the talent and the volume the Malik Nabers is receiving does outweigh the quarterback concerns, and you could even argue that he got a quarterback upgrade this year with Russell Wilson, obviously Jameis Winston for fantasy friendly, quarterback play if he gets into the games, and Jaxon Dart as well. So I think there's definitely some reasons why we should be very bullish on Malik Nabers here this year. Let's go to my number 7 overall guy. It's going to be Nico Collins. Nico Collins, he missed time last year, but he still cleared 1,000 yards in 12 games played. He was on pace during his healthy stretch for 1,400 yards and 10 touchdowns with CJ Stroud last year. So I think this is a player that has true wide receiver 1 upside if CJ Stroud levels back up to that prior form that we've seen him be so good at before, and maybe not so much what we saw last year. But even then, like I said, last year he was on pace for 1,410. Let's go to Drake London. Drake London is my number 8 overall wide receiver. He finished as the wide receiver 6 last year in 2024. He had 100 catches and 9 touchdowns. The thing about him, 25 red zone targets. That's what I like the most. It was tied for the 4th most in the NFL, and I think a big year is very likely to happen again here with with Michael Penix if Michael Penix takes that step forward again. So we can definitely rely on Drake London for our fantasy teams here in 2025. And let's go to the last player in this tier for me. It's number 9, Bryant Thomas Jr. This is a player who finished as the wide receiver 4 as a rookie. He averaged 14.1 fantasy points per game, and that was despite playing half of the year with Mac Jones. You know, they got a new coaching staff here in the building, an improved offense. Maybe that equals an even higher ceiling for a guy like Bryant Thomas Jr. I think he's a legit wide receiver 1 candidate with Trevor Lawrence and Liam Cohen running the show. But how much is Travis Hunter going to take away from him? My guess is not too much as a rookie, still believing in Bryant Thomas as a top 10 player. Moving on to my tier 3, I'm going to kick it off as wide receiver 10, AJ Brown. AJ Brown's targets per game, they did drop from 9.3 targets per game in 2023 to 7.5 targets per game in 2024, as Philly really did decide to lean on that run game with Saquon Barkley. Now, the Eagles, they were run heavy, but they do have a tougher schedule here in 2025. So that combined with maybe some defensive losses that they've had over the offseason may force a little bit more passing from this team here in 2025. I still think AJ Brown is a top 12 wide receiver talent, especially if that volume kind of rebounds back up to where we saw pre-2024 when he was seeing those 9 targets per game in 2023. Let's go to my wide receiver 11. That's going to be Ladd McConkey. He had a very solid rookie year as well. A strong year 2 breakout profile is really what we're looking at here for Ladd McConkey. The back half of the season was very, very good for him. I think he's competing with a really run-heavy offensive scheme, but he is pushing a 25 to 30% target share out of the slot. So, you know, you lose a little bit of that volume, but you are seeing a ton of the pie when you are deciding to pass that football. So he's a high upside pick as well. And I think with some elite quarterback play from Justin Herbert, it does help us make the case for Ladd McConkey as a top 12 guy. Let's go to T. Higgins. T. Higgins comes in as my wide receiver 12. This is a player that had over 20% of the target share despite Ja'Marr Chase dominating last year in 2024. He finished with his career best numbers of his career. The Bengals throw a ton. We kind of already talked about that. So I do think Higgins remains a solid top 20 wide receiver option. And I do think he has some huge upside here if Ja'Marr Chase misses any time in 2025. So he should be ranked as a top 12 guy in those weeks for the majority of the year. This Bengals offense, they're going to pass the football a ton. T. Higgins should be a top 12 guy, at least maybe a top 15 guy in most people's rankings. Let's go to Tyreek Hill. Tyreek Hill's an interesting case. He comes in as my wide receiver 13. Had a down year last year due to that wrist injury that he had, Tua missing some time, and obviously some off the field issues that just seem to always happen with Tyreek Hill. 1.75 yards per route run was a career low for him, and he's turning 31 this season. So there is risk of a decline, but I think if he's healthy and focused, he could be a value at his current ADP and still a player that I think can flirt with those wide receiver 1 numbers from a week-to-week basis. And the last player for me here in this tier, number 14, is going to be Rashee Rice. He did miss most of 2024 with that knee injury that he suffered there in week 4. He is trending towards being ready for week 1, so that is good to see. I do think when he's healthy, we saw that 25% target share last year. He's been a yak monster with Mahomes. This is a player that I think has a high ceiling. The legal issues from the offseason, they could lead to a suspension. That's something we've been talking about for over a year now. So really, that's something that I'm not really worried about at this point in time until we get some further information. Maybe something to monitor, but it's not anything that is keeping me from drafting Rashee Rice right now at this current point in time. Going on to my tier 4, let's kick it off. Wide receiver 15, Garrett Wilson. This is a player who finished as the wide receiver 9 last year despite a very poor offense there for the New York Jets. He has 3 straight seasons of 80+ catches and 1,000 yards, and he is expected to earn anywhere between a 30 and 35% target share this year with Justin Fields and a very weak depth chart around him. So he's a player that I think maybe doesn't have the elite ceiling we want with this current passing offense there for the Jets, but he has a very safe floor, and I think he's somebody that we can still draft very confidently here in 2025. Let's go to my wide receiver 16. That's Davante Adams. Davante Adams had 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns for 5 straight years, even with bad quarterback play through a majority of those years as well. He's going to be playing behind Puka Nacua this year, who does have top 12 weekly upside, but I do think so does Davante Adams, and he's an elite handcuff potentially if Puka misses time, which is something we've seen happen in the past before. So Davante Adams is a great value currently in drafts and somebody that I have high hopes for just maybe one more year out of him here in 2025. Let's go to wide receiver 17. Last year's disappointment, to be honest, Marvin Harrison Jr., very underwhelming rookie year. Still had a solid year though. I think it's kind of being brushed under the rug a little bit. It's just the thing was everybody was so in on Marvin Harrison Jr., the hype got out of control. He's a player that I think is a second-year breakout candidate now that the ADP is a little bit more reasonable in drafts. I think he's a wide receiver too with some upside to still develop into an alpha in this offense with Kyler Murray. So somebody I'm still looking to draft on my teams. Wide receiver 18, former OSU teammate Jaxon Smith-Njigba. This is a player who has a clear path to volume, especially after Tyler Lockett was cut this offseason and DK Metcalf was traded to the Pittsburgh Steelers. The new offensive coordinator here and an unstable quarterback situation with Sam Darnold and Jalen Milroe Burrow does add a little bit of risk to JSN if you ask me. I think he has a very expensive ADP as well, so he does need a top 15 finish to justify the draft cost that you currently have to use to get him onto your fantasy football rosters. Let's go to my wide receiver 19. That's going to be Terry McLaurin. Terry McLaurin, he scored 13 touchdowns on 117 targets in 2024, which really isn't sustainable for the most part. So there is some regression that is likely to occur with Terry McLaurin. However, he's still a good player. I just don't think he's going to be a weekly difference maker unless he catches that long big play touchdown that we've seen Jaden Daniels hit him with before. So to me, I'm viewing this player more as a flex low-end wide receiver 2, especially if those touchdown numbers come down a little bit here in 2025. Let's go to wide receiver 20. This is where I'm going to put Mike Evans. Mike Evans has 11 straight years of 1,000 yards, and he's still an elite efficiency type of wide receiver with 2.33 yards per route run in pretty much every single season. This is a player that also is probably going to see some touchdown regression, maybe not for Mike Evans specifically, but maybe for his teammate here in Baker Mayfield, who was lights out in 2024. Evans is still a player, though, that I think can go for 1,000 yards and 8 to 10-ish touchdowns here during 2025. Age 32 is a little bit concerning because we do see that production drop off a little bit, but it hasn't dropped off yet. So I still think at this point in time, we haven't seen anything to fade Mike Evans. He's still a top 24 wide receiver in my rankings. Let's go to my last and final player in this tier, my wide receiver 21. I'm going to go with DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. The volume stayed consistent for DJ Moore in 2024, but his efficiencies dropped to a career low. So Burden and Loveland, they do join the mix here during 2025. They were drafted by this regime. Moore is still going to be the target leader in my opinion here in Chicago. He does need Caleb Williams to take that step forward to regain that top 20 value from a week-to-week basis, but he's still a player that I think is right here on the fringe, a low-end wide receiver 2 in my rankings right now, and someday I still think you can draft fairly confidently, especially if you believe in the Ben Johnson improvement here in Chicago. Let's move on to my tier 5. My tier 5, I'm going to kick it off with wide receiver 22, DK Metcalf. This is a player who is now the clear wide receiver 1 in Pittsburgh after Pickens has exited, went to the Dallas Cowboys. Probably going to see somewhere between a 25 and a 30% target share, but he is going to be in a low volume Arthur Smith type of offense where we haven't really seen elite wide receivers be produced by Arthur Smith so far across his coaching career. The quarterback play is a concern with Aaron Rodgers at this point in time, probably more of a boom bust profile with week winning upside, but this is also a player that probably has a really sketchy and a floor that can fall out from underneath you. It's probably a risky high upside type of play with DK Metcalf this year. Let's go to Courtland Sutton. Courtland Sutton comes in for me at 23. This is a player who quietly finished as the wide receiver 13 in 2024 thanks to solid quarterback play from Bo Nix. Now, he does have no real threat to his role as the top wide receiver in Denver. They did add some additional pass catching options in Evan Engram and RJ Harvey out of the backfield, who I think is going to do a little bit more than what Javonte Williams did last year. However, we should still be viewing Courtland Sutton as a reliable wide receiver 2, maybe a wide receiver 3 option with some steady volume and quite a few red zone opportunities throughout the year. Go to my wide receiver 24, Davante Smith. As I said with AJ Brown, the Eagles' low passing volume, it did hurt Smith's overall consistency last year during the 2024 season. I do think he needs a couple more passing attempts to thrive in this offense, but he can still pop off any given week despite, the fact that they're not really throwing the football a ton. At least they weren't last year. That being said, this is a player who does have a lot of strong contingent upside, especially if AJ Brown misses time. This could be a player that could develop into a league winner if that were to happen. So maybe a safe wide receiver 2, safe wide receiver 3 type of pick that has some upside if some things fall his way. Let's go to Jameson Williams, who comes in as my wide receiver 25. This is a player who broke out last year in 2024 under Ben Johnson. They got a new offensive coordinator in town. It's better Lions defense. I do think this could reduce those shootout games that we saw the Lions in last year. This is still a player, though, that I think has some explosive weekly upside, even if the volume dips a little bit here in 2025. Let's go to wide receiver 26. I got George Pickens here. It's a big upgrade right now in situation moving to Dallas with Dak Prescott compared to what he had last year with Mason Rudolph and some other bums there in the Pittsburgh Steelers offense. He's the clear wide receiver 2 behind CeeDee Lamb, and I do think he fits this offense really well as the X wide receiver outside in this offense. He's a great wide receiver 3 play, a flex play that has some spike week potential and a very high powered passing attack here during the 2025 season. Moving on to Xavier Worthy, he's the last player in this tier for me. He comes in as my wide receiver 27. He finished very strong as Mahomes' go-to option there for the late part of the year with the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously, Rashee Rice was not on the football field at that point in time, but he led Kansas City in targets, yards, and touchdowns from weeks 13 onward for the rest of the season. So Rice is back though. Hollywood Brown is healthy. I think the target share is a risk to come down a little bit here in 2025. This is still a player though that I think has a high ceiling, spike week potential, especially if your roster can handle some of that volatility that might come with a guy like Xavier Worthy. And this is a player that can still give you those wide receiver 2 spike weeks and things like that. So definitely like Xavier Worthy, especially if your roster can handle some of the volatility that might come with a guy like Xavier Worthy. Let's go on to tier 6. Tier 6 is going to start it off with wide receiver 28, Rome Odunze. Another disappointing rookie that did have a year, that wasn't really up to par after having top 10 draft capital. He does get some new competition here in Luther Burden and Colston Loveland that does muddy the waters a little bit as far as how we can project target share. However, it's hard to tell how much of that last year was on Rome versus how much of that was on the scheme that they had for the Chicago Bears and some of the quarterback play that came with that scheme that they were playing with. I think there's a wide range of outcomes for a guy like Rome Odunze this year, but he is a player that does have that year 2 type of breakout profile that you should be targeting, especially if you can get him a little bit later in drafts. But I don't know if we're going to get that much of a discount on Rome Odunze. Let's talk about my wide receiver 29. I got Tet McMillan here. This is a player who should be the clear wide receiver 1 in Carolina from day 1. Bryce Young is still a wild card very much for fantasy football purposes, but I do think that the volume that T-Mac is supposed to see here is going to be very favorable for fantasy football. It's not necessarily a player that we view as an elite prospect. He's a very good prospect, not an elite one like Malik Nabers was last year, but the back half wide receiver 2 numbers are in play here, especially later in the season as they start to click a little bit more often. Let's go to Zay Flowers, who comes in as my wide receiver 30. This is a player who finished as the wide receiver 21 last year, which does feel underwhelming given the ADP that he had at that time. The touchdown ceiling is going to be limited for Zay with Derrick Henry on this offense and Mark Andrews still around, but I do think about 1,000 receiving yards and 5 to 7 touchdowns is a pretty fair projection for a guy like Zay Flowers. This is a player you can draft as a safe wide receiver 2, but he's probably not going to give you a ton of spike weeks, and he's probably not a guy that's going to be considered a league winner at the end of the season. Let's move on to Jalen Waddle, who is the last player in this tier for me, coming in as wide receiver 31. 2024 was rough. Like I mentioned, the Dolphins situation was bad. Tua was hurt. There was a lot of things that went wrong, and because of that, Jalen Waddle saw a career low 1.53 yards per route run. Like I said though, Tua, not really the best last year. Jonnu Smith also kind of siphoned some of that volume away from Jalen Waddle, who is no longer there. That said, I still think Waddle is an explosive player, and if Tyreek does decline a little bit here this year, which isn't out of the range of outcomes, I think Waddle could boom for fantasy football teams. He's a player that has a very modest ADP. He does have some risk, but if you're into giving second chances, I do think a guy like Jalen Waddle might be a guy that could break out and see some increases in his overall production here during the 2025 season. And now let's go to my tier 7 to round out my top 36. We're going to kick it off here at 32 with Chris Olave. Chris Olave, he is seeing a quarterback downgrade from Derek Carr with Derek Carr now retired. Obviously, it feels crazy to say that you downgraded from Carr, but I think that might have been what has happened here for the Saints. The Olave concussion history is also a major red flag, I think, for him at this point in time. That said, Kellen Moore, he should have an offense here that can help elevate a guy like Chris Olave when he's on the football field. So if you're betting on Chris Olave, I think this is a talent over situation type of bet. Again, another guy kind of like Zay Flowers who's not going to be a league winner, but if he's healthy for the majority of the year, probably a value and probably somebody who you're going to be very happy that you drafted because he's going to have a very solid, safe floor most weeks. Let's go to my wide receiver 33. I got Calvin Ridley sitting here. This is a player that I have had a very tough time with. Obviously, when you're looking at the profile for him, it's hard not to see a path to 125 plus targets here for the Tennessee Titans because there's really nobody else established in this offense outside of Ridley. So the volume, it should be fine, but I do have a little bit of worries about Cam Ward's efficiency here as a rookie during the 2025 season. So this is a player who probably has a safer floor, a limited ceiling. Again, a guy that's probably not going to win you your league, but I don't think he's going to be a guy that kills you in your fantasy football leagues either. Probably just a good, not great option unless you truly believe that at 30 years old, Calvin Ridley is going to bounce back to what he was back when he was with the Atlanta Falcons, which I just think is out of the range of outcomes at this point in time. Let's move on to my wide receiver 34. Here's where I'm going to put Chris Godwin. Chris Godwin was the wide receiver 2 overall before his ankle injury in 2024, but now with Emeka Egbuka being there and Liam Cohen gone, I do think it kind of complicates things a little bit here for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And if fully healthy, I think that's the biggest question mark with Chris Godwin right now. If he's fully healthy, I think he can be a huge value for your fantasy football teams, but the injury that he's currently recovering from, the target competition, I do think it makes it a little bit harder to project what will happen with Chris Godwin here this year. Let's go on to my wide receiver 35. I got Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers here. He had an unexpected breakout in 2024, and I think a lot of that is really just because of all of the injuries that were scattered across that San Francisco offense. He had some elite efficiency numbers with 2.26 yards per route run last year, and the volume, it should stay pretty solid, especially if Ayuk is still rehabbing at the start of the season to come back from that injury that he suffered, and with Deebo Samuel now no longer in the picture. I do think he's a player that's a great late round pick who could start out hot out of the gates, but maybe loses a little bit of that role over the course of the year as guys like Ayuk get a little bit healthier and things like that. And now my last and final player coming in as wide receiver 36, I got Jakobi Meyers of the Las Vegas Raiders. This is a player who's not really flashy, but he's been ultra consistent over the last couple of seasons. Last year having 105 targets and a 1,200 yard pace after the Davante Adams trade mid-season for the Las Vegas Raiders. He does get a quarterback upgrade here with Geno Smith, so I do think he can be a target magnet again here in this offense. I think this is a guy who we can think of as kind of, Pete Carroll now in Las Vegas, the new Tyler Lockett for fantasy football. Safe, boring, but productive. Somebody that you probably want to have there at the end of your starting lineup that you can safely plug into a flex when you need them. So that is my top 36 wide receivers here at this point in time, right after the 4th of July, going into the redraft season. I'd be interested to know who you guys think I am high on, low on. What are your thoughts here about these rankings? I'm very excited for the redraft content to keep coming out over the next couple of weeks as we ramp that up as the season approaches. I just can't say, enough how excited I am for football again. Sitting there last night, hear Troy Aikman's voice in my mind, and I'm like, I think I'm going crazy, but it's about that time. I need that fall weather and that football. So hopefully you guys are excited. If you like the content, hit the like button for me. It is the best free way to show this channel some support. And if this is your first time seeing the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We don't want you to miss out any future content. We want to help you guys win your fantasy football leagues here in 2025. So hopefully you can stick along and we can do that for you here during this season. And last but not least, make sure you go join our free Discord. We do have a free Discord linked in the description, helping you guys with your fantasy football teams 24/7, 365, and a dope community of people there to chat with, kind of bounce some ideas with throughout the season. If you have trades, waiver talks, things like that, we got all of that covered there in that Discord. But with all of that out of the way, I have nothing else for you guys today. So I will see you on our next episode. Until then though, peace out.